Hey, what's up? This is Carlo of 4GQ TV. We have a very special interview today. And before we get to our special guest, I quickly want to introduce Dion, aka PK, as everybody knows in the community.
Hey, what's good? And thank you for everyone.
And then we have Paul, aka Cerebral Paul.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be here.
And I'm probably going to say your name wrong.
No, it's not.
It's
He's actually named after an old language, programming language.
Pascal?
Yes.
Yeah,
yeah,
there you go.
absolutely. Pascal Losambe, yes. So well done, Dion. Yeah. Back in the day, I believe I learned how to code in Pascal and then forgot it all. Turbo, whatever it's called, Turbo Pascal.
That was a beautiful programming language back then.
I
Speak for
don't know.
yourself.
I don't know about that, but had to do it when I was younger for sure.
Um, Pascal, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got started into what you do?
Yeah, absolutely, Carlo. So I was born in Ado Ekiti, Nigeria. My family actually hails from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is Central Africa. And my dad was studying, he has his doctorate in English literature. And so he studied in Nigeria. From Nigeria, we moved to Swaziland, which is also known as Eswatini today. From Eswatini, we moved to South Africa. And then that's where I spent a lot of my formative years. And when I was 16, my father announced that we were moving to Burlington, Vermont. And I thought that he was going to ruin my life because I was kind of finding my groove as a 16-year-old with people I connected with and knew. Um, and so that actually, I tell that because that started my journey into this work as someone who was transnational, going from place to place. I found that it was so imperative for me to be surrounded by people that cared about me, that saw me, that created environments of belonging where I could feel a sense of value. Because as you can imagine, as you go from country to country, you learn a new way of being, learn a new culture. There are certain things that you do that are different from what you've done. And so people in my life were so instrumental to me feeling a sense of belonging in those environments. And so, as I started to navigate the world, I fell in love with the sciences and started to study the brain and how it dictates behavior alongside the mind. And I studied that and was really fascinated and intrigued by human behavior. And so I studied and went to school and got my degree in biology and molecular biology to understand the nature of the world, the mystery of the world. And it was also fascinating to me. Um, but the science world is very intense, and dare I say, even toxic. And so I found myself not loving what I was doing as I kind of went through upper levels of academia. But I always loved teaching. Teaching was something that was the golden thread in my joy. And so one day I told my thesis advisor, I'm going to write my thesis and I'm going to go and teach. And he supported that decision. So I went to teach in high school. I was a high school science teacher for a long time. And it was in that place where I saw students really searching for something that made them feel authentic, made them feel like they belonged. And that intrigued me. And so I started to kind of delve deeper into the concepts of belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and I decided, hey, let me go study this even more and learn some theories. And so today, my work kind of bridges those two worlds, the neurobiology, neuroscience world with human behavior, where we can explain what is going on in our minds and our hearts and our brains when we experience different things, especially relating to identity. And my mantra or my call is to um, show individuals how powerful our interconnectedness is as human beings. And at the level of the mind and the brain, which is still very much an emerging field, We are discovering such new things about who we are as humans and how connected we are in our shared humanity.
Wow. Wow,
How's that
that's
for a
awesome.
summary?
Yeah, well, I that's pretty amazing. And you was a key speaker at one of the conferences I attended, so well versed and very deep understanding on, and I was super impressed, especially looking at your book, how you take the science to that next level, seeing
Yeah.
how you know, we all have the same senses and how we all kind of interconnect on a scientific level, which I never even thought of, right? Um, but I think it was amazing. I think you definitely have a different angle of having this kind of conversation. Um, so what is your ultimate goal and your journey here, blending these two? And I see you doing talks and around different places. But what is your goal and your motivation that makes you keep doing or even growing in this this new sector you created, basically blending science with the social ethics.
Thank you, Dion. I think that what I've noticed is as people start to understand the science behind human behavior, they feel a sense of connection to the person that might share different core identities in a way that has intrigued me. And so, as I delve deeper into these topics, as I study, as I learn, again, the human being is meant for connection. We have these fundamental human needs that I can't actually fulfill myself. I need you, Dion, Cerebro Paul, and Carlo. You have to help me fulfill those human needs in relationship. And oftentimes I often say that my role and my job is to remind people of what they actually already know deep down in their hearts and in their souls and in their minds. Just to remind them to do the things that they know to do in order to build bridges and connections. And the way our brain is designed, it's designed to function in a specific way. And as a result of understanding how your brain functions in different situations, you can actually counteract it. You can take control and agency over it and make sure that you are positioning yourself to not always operate in this default mode, but really take charge of who you are, your authentic self, what you know to be true, and train your brain to behave in ways that builds bridges and connections, which will ultimately bring unity and a collaboration in the world. And I believe that that is possible if we continue on this journey.
Man, this man is so deep. I don't even know. My brain is like trying to process all this stuff. Paul,
Okay. So I have a question about that then, because
Yes.
I'm going to understand my own growth over the last 20 years. Um, the way I view other people and the way I interact with other people has changed a lot over the last 20 years. And I don't know that I was consciously going on looking for that change, but I think I'm maybe because I was open to looking at what other people had to say, and that my view wasn't necessarily the right view, and starting to kind of pick things apart. Is that kind of what you're kind of talking about a little
Yeah.
bit?
Oh, absolutely. And for example, Cerebral Paul, when you talk about how your posture and how you interact with people has changed, it is actually an indication that your brain and your mind were also evolving and changing due to interactions that you've had. When I first log onto a Zoom call like this and I see Carlo, Cerebral Paul, and Dion, who I know Dion, but the people on this page that I don't know, my brain is actively trying to figure out who you are. And the only thing I get to go by is what I see on the surface. Dion said Carlo is Italian, Cerebro Paul, you're also Italian. So I'm trying to make sense of it. My brain actually goes into the file cabinet of my experiences and is actively searching the files as to what I know about Italian people, what I know
Hmm.
about white people.
Mm.
And it's imposing kind of this template that I have lived through onto you. But what happens is, as I get to know you, Paul, as you were vulnerable enough to tell me about your passion in the gaming world, you are actually becoming more multidimensional to me. You're becoming more human to me. And as a result of you coming more human to me, I can sense a deeper level of connection with you. So it actually sends me into a place of curiosity to try and understand you even at a deeper level. But oftentimes we don't give people ample opportunity. We are in the posture where we have triggers as well. And somebody has to say those trigger words for me to get defensive, for me to kind of label you unconsciously as them and me as the us, and start to look for information that will confirm you're not for me. And so, if we understand that about ourselves, if we understand that through your human interactions with people, as you start to understand that, you become more curious, you become less married to your perspective because of the experiences you've had in those spaces, that your brain now knows to say, there might be more to this person than I think.
It's kind of, yeah, because I used to work with kids a lot, and so every
Hmm.
once in a while I would get a phone call, and they would go, you were the first really disabled person that they dealt with or that they were around, and you were a lot of fun, and you were, you can ask these guys. I have a very a wild sense of humor, so I would get these phone calls going, my kid saw another handicapped person and just ran over and started messing with him in a good way. In other words, they weren't afraid to approach the person in the wheelchair.
Hmm.
And it's because of that memory of dealing with me. Part of it is thinking that they're all like me. And I'm like, yeah, don't let them do that. They're not all like me.
Mm. Mm.
But yeah, so I can see how that works. That the children were basing their experience with me on how they were going to treat this other person in a wheelchair or on crutches like anybody else instead of going, oh, that's weird. You know,
That's so powerful, Cerebral Paul, because as you talked about working with children, your brain is electrical. So
yeah,
whenever you're in a creative mode, it emits these wavelengths, these
yeah,
electrical waves that we can actually measure. When you're sleepy, when you're creative, when you're angry, your brain goes into a certain brain state. Research finds that children are predominantly in what they call the theta and alpha brain states. And why is that significant? Because in those brain states, we actually start to download templates on how we see the world. So a study was done that showed that you are more susceptible to confirmation bias when you are in that alpha brain state. So what that means is, if you hear information that confirms what you think or feel, you're not likely going to look at that information critically, but accept it at face value. That's confirmation value because it confirms what you already think or feel. The same brain state is for kids. They are going to take the interaction with cerebral Paul, and now they're creating a template of how to approach the world. And if they didn't meet cerebral Paul, they'll likely base it on social media, on the adults in their lives, on their peers, which might not be a healthy depiction as well. So in interacting with you, in getting to know you, you have created a template for understanding people with disabilities in a very powerful way, and actually probably changed those children's way of thinking and outlook on life. So I'm just so blessed to hear how that has kind of come full circle for them to tell you that information.
So you mentioned something that was very interesting to me. You mentioned about the perception when you first meet people, and I guess there people always say first impressions matter. So it makes me think of that. But also at the same time, you mentioned that if you, let's say, you are looking to experience, the brain is looking to experience something for the first time, meeting somebody else, and they have a bad experience, it builds this thing like this a mechanism that says, okay, this type of person or this type of personality is this way, right? But at the same time, as complex as that is, because people are complex and people change, how can we get people to change that perception and break through that barrier instead of having that person's brain label that way forever? How can we break through to people that are very,
in default mode?
yes.
Wonderful question, Carlo. I'll answer it in two ways. Number one, there are three levels at which we can know someone. There is a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. A level 1 is if you are kind of an acquaintance with somebody. If I meet Cerebral, Paul, Dion, and Carlo, and my interactions are always, hi, how are you? How was the weekend? The weather? Oh my goodness. Oh, did you see that sports team? Oh, the Cincinnati Bearcats. If I stay at that level with you, then my impression of you is going to be based on what other people tell me about you. But if I
Deep.
go to the second level, where I start to learn about your goals, your hopes, maybe even your fears, then I get to know you at a deeper level. And there's this wonderful chemical in your brain, which is called the love hormone, also known as oxytocin. As I get to know you at a deeper level, that chemical is actually released and it facilitates connection, the feeling of connectedness. But there's a third level when I start to understand you in a bigger context of your story, your past, what you've been through, what you've experienced, what you hope for the future. That context is the deepest level of connection I can have with you, and oxytocin is released. And so the mere fact that I can have an interaction with you at a deep level allows me to break down those preconceived notions or biases or even confirm them on the other end for you. Number two is there are three ways in which the brain changes. Number one, when I focus. When I focus on something, when I pay attention, when I focus, and then when I start to play or have fun with you in different ways. So a child's brain is very malleable because when they're in a task, often they're in a task, they're focused, they're attentive, and they love to play. And so a child's brain is very malleable. And so we as adults, I, unfortunately, we have lost that sense of play, that sense of adventure, that sense of doing things together that are fun, because that allows us to actually engage you with you at a deeper level. And so maybe you all are gamers and you like to have fun with one another. In those interactions, that's play, that's fun, and you're focused and attentive. And so you relating in that environment is actually bringing you closer together. There are these chemicals, endorphins, of course, and there's this chemical that are called endocannabinoids that are released by your body when you do physical activity or you do activities together. So you might notice that you become or you feel closer to people when you maybe go and do some physical activity together, when you game together, when you maybe go for a stroll or play chess or do whatever. As you engage in activities together, these chemicals are released that actually facilitate connection. And so doing things together, being in an environment where we go deeper than just the surface, I think is the key for us to understand who we are and understand whether this is someone that I feel a sense of connection with, that I can ultimately trust enough to go deep with them.
I know for me, it's when I do podcast.
Yeah.
If I
Relax.
because I relax and I start to have fun and poke at people and they poke back and we're just
Yeah.
we just end up playing with each other for an hour or two, you know.
Should we tell him,
Right.
Paul? Should we say the word? Pineapple Paul. No, I'm just kidding.
No, no,
No.
no.
He, he doesn't like pineapples, but
Doesn't
I
like
don't
I
know.
know. I
pineapples.
was like, my brain was like, what does that mean, pineapple Paul?
So
Means I don't like pineapple on pizza and they like to rub it in my face.
So I would say that everything you said was beautiful, and a lot of, people is going to look at this and be like, "Wow, this is a lot to learn." Um, my I have a question about we all as human, we all face challenges, and one of the challenges is people who feel threatened by the kind of information that you are attempting to educate and kind of, foster this new, um, you know a community, basically get everyone together to understand that we're all connected. How do you deal with these challenges and these people who are basically against, without, truly understanding, but just against and stand against what you're trying to do?
Yeah, again, I think it's easy in that environment to get triggered because even though I know this theoretically, I still give myself permission to be human. I will still get triggered by people who say or do certain things, especially in times where I'm tired, I'm hungry, a little bit stressed out. Those narratives of us versus them exist. And the thing is, when I encounter somebody and they trigger me by something they've said or something they do or something they say, that activates my survival circuit almost immediately. And in that survival circuit, in that part of my brain that gets very emotional, I tend to get defensive. I will start to double down on what I think is true. I start to label you as a threat. And the way the brain works is very objective. So whenever there's a threat, your hope is to get away or eliminate that threat. So I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to interact with you because you are a racist or you are misogynistic or you don't respect people with disabilities or you are XYZ. And so what we have to try and do, and it's not easy, is to actually train our brains to access that higher order thinking because that's not the default. The default is to go into self-preservation mode because you are the thing that is most important, not them. And so as a result, you have to be able to ask curious questions. You have to be able to know how to disarm yourself when you are in that mode. Oftentimes, people have said that they will start to kind of write down things, but they're not writing down anything. That kind of repetitive motion is actually very soothing. That's why we love water, the waves, that repetitive motion is very soothing. When you get into that defensive mode, um, your emotional brain is actually drawing oxygen and glucose, which are the key nutrients for the brain, away from your higher order thinking, and blood flow is populating that emotional brain. So now I am assigning you an intention based on how I feel. I assume you're not for me. Your intention is to challenge me and not be for me. Your intention is to come against me and not understand what I've been through, and then I can default into the popular narratives that already exist about people who look like you. So that can be a default. So I think my journey, and I'm with people in this, is to train the brain with techniques and skills and tools to be able to be curious in the moment, to connect with the person and understand what might be driving their feeling of this. And it's not easy. It sounds very sexy in theory, but in practice it is really hard. But the thing is, as you think about it, as you attempt it and as you practice it, you will become better at accessing that higher self more often than you would have if you were not aware. So it's tough. It's hard. But I think that we can, in our shared humanity, connect with people because as human beings, we are all talking about the same needs.
Right.
And if you take any story and any experience and you break it down and you break it down and you break it down, we are talking about some fundamental human needs: a need for safety, a need for belonging, a need for esteem, to have a sense of accomplishment, to feel worthy. And we are also talking about achieving our full potential. And so if you can understand that about me, then let's start from that place of commonality, that we are trying to achieve the same goals. And what you are saying is affecting me because it's affecting my ability to achieve a certain fundamental human need. So let's dialogue and talk about it.
So
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say real quick that so in my upbringing, there was a lot of, I would say, primal um responses to things, like very primal, not very evolutionary or educational, right? It was more like primal thinking. So, and what I'm taking from this is that in our brains, it's very common that when we get insulted, upset, angry, it's easy to go to that primal state
Yes.
and be like, okay, it's fight or flight time. I'm gonna get mad at you and that's it, or I'm gonna walk away from you because I don't want to be mad, so I'm gonna flight away. But if we think deeper that we're all human and we all make mistakes and we all have our own issues, that goes into the evolutionary process of we all have something in common, regardless of how we feel in this moment. We all relate on a human level and we all have felt this way at some time in our lives before. So when people get into a primal state of thinking, because I will say that my father had very primal states of thinking, how can we help people get out of that primal state of thinking if they seem to be upset with us, or if, let's say, they want to walk away from us? A great example would be, husband and wife gets mad at husband, so she's not talking to the husband now, right? That's another fight or flight response. How can we break that cycle in people when we
I'll
see
tell
it?
you one thing not to do. Don't tell me to calm down. I think
Yeah.
Well,
That's true. That is
well,
so true.
well, everybody has a trigger. So those words react different depending on who you are. Sounds like Paul doesn't like pineapple or don't calm down. But go ahead. I'm
No,
sorry. I didn't jump in there.
and that's important. Knowing yourself is very important. Knowing how you receive feedback is very important. Knowing that sometimes people might need space in order to calm down and cool down in order for them to be able to come back and have a conversation that needs to happen. And I think that's okay. But if a person is willing to engage with you, there are certain techniques that you can employ even in the heat of the moment. For example, you can make your intentions known. And the way to do that is to use contrast statement. I don't want our relationship to struggle as a result of this situation. So I do think it's important that when you come back, we talk about it. Or I do think that we have to find a way to talk about it. So again, you have stated your intention, the common goal of the relationship working. I don't, but I do want this is a technique. Number two, Charles Duhigg just released a book this year called Super Communicators, which is an amazing book. And he says that there are three conversations you can have in a conversation. You can have an emotional conversation. So the example you use, Carlo, is the spouse. Oftentimes, we can have a conversation mismatch. Somebody is telling you something of, I had the worst day and this person did something to me. And you might come and say, you need to calm down. You need to be thankful that you have a job. That is a mismatch. When somebody is having an emotional conversation with you, what you need to match is the connection. You have to connect. So an example would be, I had a very terrible day. This coworker came and they don't pay me enough for this. Wow, that seems like you had a difficult moment at work. That's connection. Keep the conversation in their world. Then you can start to have a social conversation where you've connected, you have, so basically at the beginning of a conversation, you're trying to get the brain to say kind of a silent yes. I am so pissed off. In politics, I don't understand why Democrats believe in this. Wow, it seems like this issue is really important to you. That simple statement gets the brain to say yes. And at the beginning of a conversation, your brain is trying to figure out what type of conversation is this going to be? Are you going to be defensive or are you going to listen? And connecting at the beginning of a conversation signals to the brain, oh, Carlo is going to listen. And then you have a emotional, social, and then you can have a practical conversation where you look for ways to move forward in the situation. But when somebody has heightened information, connect or heightened emotional conversation, keep the conversation in their world. Ask questions about the conversation because that starts to disarm them. Because the brain is saying, Carlo is listening, Carlo is connecting, Carlo is feeling alongside you. And that allows them to be more open to a more detailed conversation. Sometimes the person needs to walk away, but a simple I do, I don't, and I do statement can help them remember that you have this goal in mind and talking about the situation is important. So there are certain techniques you can learn. It's clunky, it's not perfect, it sounds good and pretty in theory, but these are some things that you can use to really have a productive conversation amidst stress and tension.
That's crazy. What was the three type of conversations you can have?
An emotional conversation, when somebody has an emotional conversation, think connect. Just connect. Just allow, so almost reflect back what you're hearing, connect with, wow, that sounds like you had a hard day. That information is connecting with them. Then you have a social conversation where you're seeking more context. Tell me more about what happened. Where were you? What do you think led the person to say this? Keeping the conversation in their world. Then the practical conversation, how can we move forward in this situation?
Wow, that's dope. I
And
wanted to take notes.
and
I like
I think sometimes when somebody comes at you with that emotional, God, I've had a really bad day, they just want to be heard. You may not
Yes,
necessarily need to get to that last part of what are we going to do about it. Once they're
yes.
heard, a lot of times they'll go, I'm done, because it's a weight off your shoulder, at least in my experience. Yeah.
That's very powerful, cerebral Paul, because as you know, the mantra in the field is that the process is as important as the outcome. So going through the process is might, as you are suggesting, cerebral Paul, might be what the person needs in the conversation. You might not resolve it, they might not feel better,
Yeah.
but they are going to say, cerebral Paul is on my side. He is somebody I can connect with in this way. And that invitation is powerful because that means that you will likely have another conversation with that
Yeah,
person
because
that will
sometimes
shift.
if I listen to you, I may not have an answer for you. There may not be an
Right,
answer that I can give you because I haven't lived that experience.
right.
I may just go, I don't know what will have, you know, um, let's see what happens, and sometimes I will tell people, I really don't know what to tell you because I can't speak to that, you know.
Yes,
but you can
that's
empathize.
powerful, cerebral Paul. Yes, you can empathize.
Yeah.
I don't know how it feels to be Paul and know everything up under God and still have a rocket wheelchair,
Mhm.
but I do empathize. That's too much knowledge for his dome.
Why do you think my dome is so big?
That's so funny.
My parents always said I had a big head for the big brain. So, uh,
Yes.
Since somebody's got to have one. Oh
so,
man.
tell us a little bit about this book that I read a little bit of. I didn't have a chance to go through the whole thing, but what I did read was very interesting.
Yeah, it's very dense. So I say it's not a cover to cover book. It's like more of a reference. If you need something on imposter syndrome, go to that chapter and read it and feel better about yourself. If you experience the microaggression, go to that chapter. So I was so interested in taking kind of some of the brain science and allowing people to see what is happening in their minds and their brains around identity, to understand their triggers, to understand, when I walk into a room and I'm the only person with a disability, a visible disability, I'm the only person who is a person of color. I'm the only person who is not dressed in a suit or a dress or some kind. What is going on in your mind and your brain in that environment? And as a result, how do you navigate those moments? And what that does is when somebody has a window into somebody else's experience, you might be more sensitive to what they might be experiencing in that environment and be better at kind of breaking the barrier to belonging. So my interest was to take the popular concepts, especially in the DEI world, and kind of break them down even further into human behavior, the mind and the brain, and see what we can learn so that we can increase empathy within our communities to allow us to be more sensitive to what people might be experiencing in that environment.
Okay, so real quick, for DEI, if you want to explain that more in layman's terms, because everybody hears the hot button term part of DEI and thinks they know what it means, but let's break it down a little more so people can better understand that it's not just that little pocket that you hear about on the 5 o'clock news. You know.
Yeah, thank you, Cerebral Paul. D stands for diversity, and we often say that diversity is a fact. Even though people might share the same racial identity or ethnic identity, on the surface, we are all diverse in our way, in our humanity. We have different backgrounds, experiences that I can search the world and I will not find another Dion. And so the experiences that you have are diverse. And so that's what we call your personal identity, your personal diversity. We are all unique. But we also have these social identities. Society has created these categories that we all fit into: your race, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your nationality, your religion, your spirituality, your disability, your socioeconomic status. We have your age criteria, millennial, baby boom. We have these criterias. We call that your social identity or your social diversity as well. So that is the D, diversity. E stands for equity. So, for example, equity means that you are taking somebody's life and experience in context and looking at what they need to achieve a certain outcome. If you're disabled, there will be disabled parking spots that will be closer to the door of a building, etc., that other people who are not disabled don't get to park in. That is equity because you're taking the experience of that individual and giving them what they need in order to be able to comfortably access the door. For individuals that might come to this country from another nation, when they go to the doctor, they might have translators to be able to allow them to fully articulate who they are, what they're feeling, in order to reach the best outcome for that person. So you're taking their experience and their life in context and giving them what they need to achieve equality, which is an outcome that resembles other groups in society. That's the E. I stands for inclusion. And inclusion means, am I in a position where my voice, where you kind of understand what I am going through or experiencing from my perspective? And is that perspective included in the conversation? So that's what we call inclusion. So, for example, you can be designing a building, and when you're designing the building, you ask yourself the question, who is missing from this conversation? And you might find that somebody who is blind is missing from this conversation. Because from that perspective, I'm going to design the building very differently because I have the data and the lived experience of what they have gone through so that I can think of where to put the elevators. I can think of how to position the stairs differently with that voice. So, am I making space for voices to be included as part of the conversation? That is what we call inclusion. And then the B often is added, which is belonging. And belonging is almost felt. So I can't say, Paul, Dion, Carlo, you belong. You have to tell me you belong. And because I don't own that belonging, I have to discover what it means for you to feel valued in this environment, what it means for you to feel supported in this environment, for you to feel as though um, belonging is felt. So to ask you whether there has to be systems and mechanisms to ask you whether you feel like you are valued and supported in this environment as well. So that is what we call belonging. That and belonging is almost saying that we have created an environment where we would not be complete without you, and as a result, we want to make sure that you are valued, supported, and affirmed in this space.
I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we need a group hug right now. It's
Oh no,
feeling
after
all
Carlos
good.
hugged me, I have to check my wallet,
Uh,
Oh wow, Paul. Hey, wait, is that because I'm Italian, Paul? Is that what you're thinking? Um, so I think everything that you've been saying is very important because it has to do a lot with perception and the way the brain looks at the world and how we develop our brains from our interactions with our environments. And there's one thing I want to ask you before we have to close the call, and I think this is important for a lot of people out there. So, a lot of people have traumatic experiences. Almost everybody in life
Mm.
has one or two traumatic experiences that make them want to stay away from something. It could be maybe when you were 5 years old, you were going to walk down to the candy store in your neighborhood and you saw something really violent or bad happen. And now you label that whole area bad. You never want to go there again. And 20 years later, it could be built up with nice houses. It could be a whole changed neighborhood with a fancy coffee shops, but you're still afraid to go there. So people with deep trauma, how can we break our traumas to re-experience something?
Yeah, that is such a powerful question, Carlo. And I think that, trauma can take different forms. I don't claim to be a therapist or psychologist. I'm an educator, so I can tell you what I've read and heard about this. Trauma can be directly experienced or it can be vicariously experienced. So Italian Americans in this country have had a very hard history. And as you might have gone through school, Carlo, you would have maybe read of situations that Italian Americans have gone through in society. And you reading those stories about the neighborhoods they were, about the discrimination they experienced, might actually trigger you because you're vicariously experiencing that trauma as well. And so that can show up in many different ways. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. So you might find that as you enter an environment, your body might tense up, you might get a headache, your fists might start to tighten, and your mouth starts to clench. That is a sign that, something might be going on here. But with traumatic experiences, the question that I've heard people ask is, do you have the skills to pull yourself out of that fight, flight, or freeze response that you experience? Do you have the skills and the tools that you are equipped with? So people have to kind of know their coping mechanisms, that they can access healthy coping mechanisms in the midst of being triggered or experiencing a trauma directly or vicariously or being triggered in that way. So what coping skills do you have and what do you bring to the table? Do you have to take a breath? Do you speak to a therapist? Do you have to take a walk? Do you have to call a loved one? What do you do in the midst of that trigger in order to kind of pull yourself out of that mode? What do you have to do in order to find your resilience? Is something that I've heard people talk about as well. Oftentimes, in that mode of trauma, you are going into your survival brain, that primitive brain you talked so well about, Carlo. And as a result, journaling can help because journaling actually calls upon your higher order thinking to kind of try and make sense of what you're experiencing, how you're feeling, what you are thinking as well. Brene Brown often says that oftentimes we are not emotionally literate. So we don't have good labels for our emotions. You might say, I'm triggered, and so I'm angry. But what you might be experiencing is maybe discouragement, which is a secondary or tertiary emotion. I am happy. What you might be experiencing is awe and wonder. So we have to be able, because if I can label my emotions, then I have a different reaction to it. There was a wonderful experiment that was done by a neuroscientist from UCLA called his name is, and my son just walked in. Everyone, hello. How are you? Can you close the door, please? Thank you. Um, sorry about that.
That's okay.
There's a renowned scientist at UCLA called Matthew Lieberman, and he did an amazing experiment where he took individuals and he put them in an MRI machine, and they were experiencing stories that made them feel a certain level of emotion. And basically, he found that if people are able to kind of label their emotions, then you actually create psychological distance from that emotion at a certain point, not maybe immediately, and then you can actually start to deal with that emotion. And so I think that in addition to knowing your coping skills, knowing your emotional literacy is actually very beneficial to label what you are feeling and what you are thinking as well. So trauma can be experienced directly, it can be experienced vicariously. And the question is, do you have the coping skills to pull yourself out of that fight, flight, or freeze response? Having the emotion is not bad, but it's a matter of asking yourself the question, do you have what it takes for you to become or get into a functional state where you can access your higher order thinking? I think that is the most important thing.
That's that's the
It's
most
awesome.
powerful. Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful because you made me think of an experience I've had in my life before, and I'm sure everybody in this panel can relate. Paul,
100%.
myself, even you, Pascal, you could probably relate. It's when I was younger, I had a friend named Nick, a very good friend. He was a very good friend. And every time he went to do something, and we were like 12, I was like 12, and he might have been like 13. But every time he went to do something, and I was stuck at home, I felt like I was missing out. So I got angry. Like I got upset because I wanted to go. If he was going to the movies with his dad who ran projectionist booths, I wanted to go to the movies because I wanted to experience it from the projection booth. And when I was younger, I would remember getting mad. Like I would get upset. And it wasn't that I was angry with him. I was upset because I was afraid of missing out. So my actual emotion then would not be essentially anger. It's more of the fear of missing out.
Right. Yes, yes, that's a very powerful example. The funny thing is like in that example, I'm actually understanding what I'm saying a little bit more. So thank you,
Yeah.
Carlo. That is a very powerful illustration of that concept. Yeah.
You know you're good when you laugh at your own jokes. I think everything you said is very powerful. Honestly, I feel like this can go on forever, but we definitely gotta be thankful, mindful of your time, and a really, really great conversation. I feel like everybody on the panel and everyone that watches later definitely will pick something up that you're putting down. And I want to make sure that we do have your links to your book and your site and everything else available. Before we close out, I just want to make sure everyone has a last comment. But I really, really, really thank you for coming through and giving us the time and opportunity to have this conversation. I feel like we all needed this. That's what I feel like. You might not be a
Likewise.
therapist. You may not be
Likewise.
a therapist, but it felt like therapy. I'm just saying. Oh man.
Thank you so much. No, this was so fun, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to do it again. And I'm evolving and learning so much. And in this conversation, I've also learned, and this world can get very heady and theoretical in a way that just creates distance from what people are actually feeling and thinking. And what
Right.
these conversations do for me is that I can bring the theory, but you can make sense of the theory in a way that is very powerful for me, relatable for me. It actually reinforces my understanding of the concepts. And I'm really thankful for that today because I think in the examples, Paul, Dion, and Carlo, that you've given, it's allowed me to kind of equip my toolbox with practical applications for this sometimes ivory tower heady stuff that makes good sense in theory, but in practice maybe doesn't translate as well. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Anybody else last comments?
I found this very interesting. Yeah, and I would love to have some more time to sit down and chat with you and go through some examples and figure out stuff. But so maybe if one day we can do that.
Yes, I would love that.
And and same thing like Paul said, like I just want to and Dion, I just want to thank you for coming on talking to us. And I was so intrigued by the way that you put things into perspective and made me think a lot about the primal aspects of our brain versus the evolutionary aspects of critical thinking.
Mm,
And it just relates to my childhood because it was just full of primal trauma. And at some point in my life, I had to either evolve from that or get stuck. And I
yes.
chose to evolve. And you brought all that knowledge into this interview. And it's just amazing. So I think everybody that listens to this is going to learn something from it.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you. Thank you. That encourages me very much.
It was great. Well, that's all we got. Closes out, Carlo. Or...
Sure. Everybody, I want to thank you for watching the interview and hanging out with us today. And Pascal, I probably is it Dr. Lasambe? Lasambe?
Yes, but please call me Pascal.
Okay. Okay.
That's yeah,
I think he
yeah.
Okay.
just called you a zombie, but that's okay.
Yes.
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
D-
whoa.
Dr. Losambe, yes.
There we go. There could be a
Sounds,
movie one day,
yeah, it
right?
sounds like a
Yeah.
Vincent Price
Yes.
movie at that point. But
I can't
Um,
take these guys nowhere. They don't know how to act.
but thank you everybody for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you check out the book. And I mean, it's been fun. And I hope to have Pascal back on. And maybe in the future, if you
Yes.
have questions, drop them in the comments and Dion, I, or Paul can relay them somehow. So thank you so much for hanging out with us. And your time is very valuable and is very much appreciated from all of us on this panel.
Thank you so much, y'all. What a pleasure. I'm filled with joy from this time together. Thank you.